All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here. And tonight, I'm so delighted to be joined by three very important figures for the library. We have our inaugural cultural fellows, Missy Mazzoli and Royce Vavrek, and our inaugural composer-in-residence, Nia Franklin. So all three of these brilliant artists have been making wonderful music and performing at the library over this past month as we have celebrated the history of literature, sound, and storytelling. Tonight will be a sort of cumulation of the Reverberations Festival that we've hosted, which has celebrated this relationship between literature and sound. And tonight it is such a pleasure to be hosting these three brilliant minds in conversation as they talk about their role as composers, librettists, artists, performers, but also the relationship between art and advocacy and the vitality of opera today. So a brief note about the Reverberations Festival. This has been organized in partnership with the Ouvrier Comique and with the generous support of Festival Napa Valley and the Florence Gold Foundation. It's a festival celebrating literature out loud. For thousands of years, as long as both have existed, in fact, poetic and musical traditions have shaped and informed one another. And this March, we have been highlighting innovations in the musical arts in a series of concerts, conversations, and workshops coming together to offer synesthetic perspectives on the history of storytelling and sound. A couple of notes about this conversation. We will be discussing for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to our in-person audience, and if we have time, our Zoom audience as well. So start thinking now about the questions that you'd like to ask these brilliant speakers as well. On to them. First, to my left, we have Nia Amani Franklin. Nia is a composer and a singer whose music has been performed by the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, Friction Quartet, Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra, Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, and many others. Previous composer-in-residence tenures include Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, California and Festival Santa Barbara, California, and Festival Napa Valley, where she was awarded the Dariush and Shapar Khaledi Prize for Excellence and Innovation in Classical Music. Her 2021 project, Extended, featured an assortment of all original R&B songs in her orchestra piece, Chrysalis Extended, which has 3.7 million views on her TikTok profile. Not bad. Next to Nia, we have, and Nia is also, as I said, the inaugural composer-in-residence at the library. And next to Nia, we have the fabulous, wonderful, impeccably dressed Royce Vavrek, who is an Alberta-born librettist and lyricist, and who has been called the Indie Hofmannsthal and one of the most celebrated and sought-after librettists in the world. His opera Angel Bones with composer Du Yun was awarded the 2017 Pulitzer Prize, and upcoming commissions include Agnes for the Icelandic Opera, Lincoln and the Bardo for the Metropolitan Opera, Fanny and Alexander for La Monnaie, Indians on Vacation for Edmonton Opera, Against the Grain, and My Family Cambodia 1975, supported by the Canada Council for the Arts. So Royce is a busy, busy man. And next to Royce, we have the brilliant, wonderful Missy Mazzoli, who is deemed one of the more consistently inventive, surprising composers working in New York, and Brooklyn's post-millennial Mozart, which is a fabulous title, and one that we will be diving into tonight, unpacking exactly what that means. Missy was the Mead composer-in-residence at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and she was also the composer-in-residence with Opera Philadelphia. Her work has been performed internationally, and in 2018, she made history as one of the first two women to be commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera, which we will also be discussing tonight. Can we have a round of applause for our brilliant composers? So to get started, I want to return to this last figure we just heard, that Missy, you're one of the first two women to be composed by the Metropolitan Opera. And you told me earlier as we were discussing, the Metropolitan Opera in its history has had two operas composed by women, and the Opéra National de Paris has had one in its entire history of existence, which is pretty astonishing. And you've done a lot of work advocating for bringing women into the arts and into opera, particularly through your organization, Luna Composition Lab. So can you tell us about your advocacy work?
Sure, yes. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you. It's great to be with Nia again, and great to be with all of you. And yeah, so, for me, it's true. I'm one of the first two women to be commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera. The amazing composer Janine Tesori and I were commissioned at the same time. So we both kind of hold that distinction of being the first women
And
commissioned.
when was that?
This was 2018.
2018.
Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
And
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's tricky because, it's been my dream since I was 15 to write for the Met Opera. But I also think it sucks that they have not commissioned women in their 165-year history. They performed a piece by a woman in 1903 that was Ethel Smythe, English composer, her opera The Wreckers. And then in 2015, so then there was a 113-year gap. And then in 2015, they performed Kaya Sariaho's L'amour de loin. And then, but no one was commissioned. So they were consistently commissioning new works by men, but nothing from women. So yeah, so it's a weird feeling, and that it's my childhood dream, but I also do want to hold them accountable for that. And I feel the way that I can sort of hold both realities in my mind is to say well, I might be the first. I'm very proud, but I cannot be the last. And if you stop commissioning women, I am going to get very upset, and I'm going to take you to task publicly for this. And they've really been good about they've commissioned since my commission. So this is in the last 3 or 4 years. They've commissioned Jessie Montgomery, Valerie Coleman. They're performing works by Gabriella Lena Frank. So they are really committing to showcasing works by women now. But yes, so all these feelings. I'm sure Nia will talk about this too. We have talked a lot about this together, and it's like, how do you? My goal is to leave this field a little better for the next generation, particularly the next generation of young women and non-binary people who are coming after me. And so the way that I'm doing that is through my organization, Luna Composition Lab. This is a nonprofit that I started with the composer Ellen Reed in 2016. And it just came out of this frustration that I'm talking about, that we weren't seeing women really being celebrated at the highest level. I was in music school for 10 years, never once studied with a female composer. Ellen didn't really meet another female composer until she was in her mid-20s, and we just thought that it doesn't have to be that way. And we were starting to have success of our own. Ellen won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. That same year I was commissioned by the Met. So we're like, now that we have this platform, we should use this to improve the situation for the next generation. So in a nutshell, Luna Lab is very simple. We connect very young female and non-binary composers who are ages 13 to 18 with prominent female and non-binary mentors in the field. So there's a competitive application process, and those composers who are selected get bi-monthly composition lessons with female mentors. And then we have a big festival at the end of our season, which brings them all to New York City. And they have their works performed. We have concerts. We take them to the Met Opera. We take them to the New York Philharmonic. We kind of immerse them in the musical life in New York and show that they have a place there. And Nia, it was amazing. We had a big alumni festival a year and a half ago, and Nia hosted our big alumni concert. So we try to, support not only these teenagers, but to show them, amazing women and non-binary people who are working in the field, and to show them that there are a lot of different ways to be a composer.
Nia, tell us about Compose Her, about your own work, and about your engagement with Missy's work as well, your commitment to women and underrepresented figures in the arts.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. There it is. Hello? Okay, awesome. Again, thank you so much for having me, and it's so great to be here with Missy and Royce. And 2018 was apparently a big year for all of us. That was the year that I won Miss America 2019. I won in September of 2018. And in April of that following year in 2019, I just noticed that I really was struggling to meet other women composers. I had met a few living in New York, because coming from North Carolina, which is my home state, I had never met a woman composer until I moved to New York, and I was in my 20s. So when I moved to New York and I realized there were so many amazing women composers, I was like, I have to be able to spread the word about this. I need to create more awareness that women composers exist, that Black female composers exist, because, again, if I didn't know any women composers, and I definitely didn't know any Black women composers. Growing up in church, I mean, we would sing hymns in church, and apart from that, I didn't even understand like that a composer could be something other than a Mozart or a Beethoven. So being able to actually move to New York and see that was really, really special. And another common thread, Janine Tesori, that was the first representation for me. I was in high school and watching a documentary about Shrek the Musical, and she was sitting at the piano composing music, and I was like, that's what I want to do. So that was when I started to realize I wanted to be a composer, through seeing a woman do it. If I hadn't seen that, I may not have comprehended that I could be a composer. Again, I loved Mozart, I loved Beethoven, I was listening to that music, my dad would play it growing up, but all you see is like them wearing like things that look like they're from, you know, the 1600s and, you know, the 1700s. So it just really clicked for me in that moment in my life. And so in April of 2019, I decided I would found Compose Her, which is an initiative. A lot of people think it's a nonprofit. It's not. It was really a campaign, an awareness campaign to let women across America know that they could be a composer, and just trying to kind of amplify the work I was doing, but also other composers who were doing amazing work too, because I was just being immersed in that, living in New York and also being able to travel America. So that was how Compose Her was born.
And I think it's so striking when you talk about being from North Carolina as well, and I know Missy and Royce, you're from Alberta, you're from Pennsylvania. We're all here in the big city, but we didn't start here, and so much of your work is testament to the fact that one can come into opera from anything, from anywhere, which is a sort of an interesting counterpoint to the image we have of opera today as something which is sort of ancient, stuffy. You know, as you said, everyone who performs opera, we think of them wearing wigs and covering their faces with powder. Royce, I was so struck by something you said in an interview where you said that your work feels in greater dialogue with the world at large. So can you tell us about how you are at work putting opera into dialogue with the contemporary world that we're living in today?
Sure, yeah. So it's funny because my into opera, I grew up on a farm, on a grain farm in northern Alberta, Canada, and opera represented the antithesis of that for me. It represented something really elegant and really moneyed, and the opposite of what my parents, the sort of humble farm lifestyle, which was a very romantic way to grow up. My goodness, I wouldn't trade it for the world. But at the time, I was like, my rebelliousness was like, I need to go and write operas. And so when I was in 9th grade, I wrote an operetta about abortion, of all things, and my mom cried in the car and said, "Why can't you just be a normal kid? Why can't you write an opera about sunflowers or something?" I remember that. I was like, because I need to write something important. So opera always represented something bigger and different from my familial experience. Now, opera is all about sort of democratizing the form and making it for absolutely everyone. And I think that one of my earliest collaborators, in 2012, I premiered 2 really important operas. The first one was Song from the Uproar with Missy. And then about 8 months later, I premiered the opera Dog Days with David T. Little. And I remember having early conversations with David where he's just like, I don't want that heightened poetry. I want you to find poetry in the everyday. And so that was something that I have carried with me and was a very, very important missive from him that has just permeated all of my work. And he said, I don't want to write operas about kings or queens. I want to write operas about people. And so I really kind of think that what I do, I write folk operas, really. Like if you were to think about what we do, we write operas that are for everyone. They're for the people. We're writing contemporary folk operas. I'm sort of, it's something that I've just been playing around with, that idea, that label over the past couple months. But and we write grand operas and things like that too. I'm very, very excited to get to use the amazing canvas of the Met and use George Saunders' words. The opera that we're writing is an adaptation of Lincoln in the Bardo, which won the Booker Prize. back in 20. Oh, that early, yeah. And so it has it has this heightened, amazing literary foundation, but it is about people. We're very interested in telling operas that deal with interactions and the sort of emotional inner lives of humans. We don't like to write operas about things or landscapes, and if people want to do that, that's amazing, and please do that. But for us, we're really, really interested in the human side of drama and storytelling. And so, yeah, I'm very curious. I write operas about so many different things. I can generally find my into most subjects. I think that the world is so fascinating and multifaceted. So it's kind of, it's interesting. I think that if you look at my catalog, I've written about 23 operas so far.
23.
They're so.
Can I ask how old you are, Royce?
I just turned 41.
Happy birthday.
Well, thank you. A couple of weeks ago, but I'll take it. Yeah, and but the producer Beth Morrison said that one of the things that sort of on my brand is that each opera functions on its own terms, right? Like if you look at a Royce Vavrek libretto, they're all so different, and so that's sort of my brand. I don't want to be sort of fall into my own traps and do the same things over and over again. I really let the stories and the characters speak for themselves and try to be the sort of ambassador or the conduit for them to sing. So yeah.
And you do it in such a collaborative way as well. I mean, something I've been so struck by in the entire period of your residency has been seeing the way that you and Missy listen to one another, respond to one another, and your willingness to share your work and share your successes with one another. You really are each other's cheerleaders. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to the sort of process of artistic collaboration that takes place between you.
Sure. Well, the question that we always get is what comes first, the words or the music? And with us, it's always the words.
I thought you were going to say the chicken.
And, so Royce will come up with a more or less complete draft of a libretto before I even start writing a note. And we'll go over those words together a lot. I mean, this is a month, sometimes years-long process of refining a libretto and making sure that the drama is really taut and that the story keeps moving and that there's no wasted space. And these libretti, they're not long, they're not novels. Like singing takes a long time. So if you sing a line of text, it stretches that text out. So, even a 2-hour opera might just be a 40-page libretto, but that also means that there's not room for any wasted text. Every bit of text has to be very important and essential to the story. And I became a composer because I had a lot of different interests, and one of them was theater, drama. Also, there was also visual art, philosophy, psychology, and being a composer allows me to do all of those things. So I'm very interested in working in the theater and working with people in that world. So once Royce has that text, I will, and we get to a more or less final form, I'll go back and start writing the music, but then there's a constant back and forth. So the text is always changing depending on the musical ideas that I have. So, and we're best friends and we live a mile away from each other in Brooklyn. That's the secret here. And so even when we're just out having fun, we're constantly in dialogue about our work, which is just one of the greatest gifts of my lifetime, truly.
Yeah, an example, we're at the Louvre, and we walked by one of the Caravaggios, and we struck up a conversation, and that has become sort of a touch point of our trip here in Paris. We're talking about how we have an idea that we would like to do after our 2 big operas, and how that painting might inform the work. And so, like, even just a passing dialogue with a painting in a gallery becomes something very important and becomes a connection for the two of us. It's a personal experience that becomes much bigger than that 1 2-minute interaction with the painting.
And this is what's so remarkable about your work is that everything in the world is open to becoming art for you, that all things can be artistic sources and nothing is closed off.
It's really hard to read for pleasure anymore. It's true. I'm always, or seeing a movie, I'm like, oh, what would I do? How would I translate this into my medium? I do, and I love reading. But I'm always thinking, I don't think there's anything out there that can't be adapted with a particular prism put in front of it. So the entire world is filled with potential stories.
I'm wondering, Nia, you're nodding along to this and you're kind of enthusiastic and going, So I'm hoping you could tell us about how you find artistic inspiration as well. And you're an opera composer, but you also work on so many other different forms of musical composition as well. You have your R&B album. I believe you composed a ballet recently. So where do you find the sources that inspire your works, and how do you move across these different genres in order to express your artistic vision?
Thank you. Yeah, similar to Royce, what you were just talking about, you don't necessarily want to be stuck in a certain type of opera that you have to write all the time. You want to be diverse in that way, and I feel the same way. I've never wanted to be put in a box, and I've grown up listening to so many different types of music, and when I discovered classical music and the kind of European sense, I knew I loved that just as much. And so it definitely is I don't want to say a balance, but it's kind of this juggling of everything that I love and that I want to pursue creatively. And so I try to work on projects that I really care about and can find that emotional connection to. And recently with the short ballet that I composed, I worked with the choreographer Sidra Bell, and it was wonderful to have that collaboration piece that I really haven't had before in a creative sense. Normally, as a composer, you just write the music, and if you're in school, you go to lessons and you talk to your teacher about it once a week, but it's really solitary. And so it was amazing to be able to speak with someone on a regular basis and talk about what we wanted to do with the work. And this work was really special because we created it from scratch. We basically had one prompt, and that was that it was going to be premiered on the last day of Black History Month in America, which is February 28th, usually 29th this year with leap year. So just incredible to work with her and carve out these ideas, which we decided to focus on motherhood, sisterhood, love, resilience. So it was a really beautiful thing. And so thinking of historic themes is something that helps me a lot creatively. Biblical themes are very important to me as a Christian. My first opera to date was King Solomon. And so that text, I was the librettist for that. I was the librettist and the composer, which is pretty rare. Usually you do work with a librettist, and I look forward to doing that as well. Again, to have that collaborative process, I think it's so cool, because being like 21, writing an opera and doing the libretto myself, wouldn't recommend.
Sounds a bit hard, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it, but it was a goal that I had ever since I was a freshman in college, and I was like, I'm gonna do this. Senior year came, and it was like, we're gonna do this. We've been working on this. But that opera was based on Song of Solomon's in the Bible, and so I put my own twist on it and kind of turned it into an opera where it started in antiquity, but it also jumped into like modern times. So yeah, religious themes really inspire me. Biblical text, poems, different authors. That I find that all very inspirational. And then people as well. Missy, actually, I remember watching Mozart in the Jungle and hearing your work. And I don't know, just being inspired by female composers of our time, listening to other composers. That is, I think, really important, especially as a composer who, I didn't have the same background as other people may have. So I was listening to like Stevie Wonder growing up, Prince, Yolanda Adams, Kurt Franklin. So that was my kind of entryway into music. So it was amazing to kind of do my own homework and dive into composers that, were from the classical era, the Baroque era, and also even now continuing to educate myself really inspires me. So thinking about the Chevalier, who a lot of people they say it's the Black Mozart, but not necessarily politically correct to say that, but he was a person of color that lived in France, and he was writing beautiful music in the time of Mozart. And so a lot of his music was destroyed, and went to school for 6 years and was never taught about this person. Had to learn about it on my own. And so really educating myself is it informs my work now, and being able to inform others and educate others on history that was erased in a lot of ways. Going back to women composers not being at the Met, for only having 2 in its history that have been commissioned and more since. But yeah, that's really important to me to educate myself and always be learning. There's always something new to explore and to learn when it comes to music and our culture and society in general. So all those things really help to push me when I don't have that inspiration, when I'm not feeling creative. I think it's really important to just continue, like keep putting pen to paper, mouse to the screen if you're working in like Dorico or something. But yeah, that's the things that work for me.
And I think it's so remarkable that in your work, not only do you have the capacity to discover all these histories that have been either forgotten or deliberately covered up, but then you're able to share them with the world, to stage them. And you encounter the importance of storytelling and your choice to tell stories on the operatic stage that one wouldn't traditionally expect to see. So Missy and Royce, the reason you're at this library at all is because we met last year while you were staging Breaking the Waves, which deals with very intense, very violent, very contemporary themes. There's sexual violence in it. There's the questions of religion. There's the questions of labor. I'm wondering if you could talk more about how you choose which stories to bring to the stage and how the question of representing untold stories or undervalued stories factors into that.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we're always talking about what stories do we want to tell, and we have about 45, ideas backlogged of things that we might want to discuss or find a way into through opera. And looking back, I can see some common threads, and that most of the work that I've done operatically, all my operas have been with Royce, so it's all been together, have been about women in impossible situations. I'm very attracted to, telling stories about women that aren't often told. I think we get such a limited perspective of women in media, whether that's TV, songs, opera, for sure. Because as we've been talking about, at the Paris Opera, unless you went to see Kaya Sarriaho's opera in the year 2000, you've only ever seen works by men on that stage. So
unbelievable.
Yeah. So, which is, and nothing against anyone in particular, but like that's a particular view of women, and we're missing a lot. We're missing a lot of perspectives on that. So I'm interested in portraying women in a complicated way, and I'm also interested in works that leave the audience with more questions than answers, which really makes the audience mad sometimes. And we accept this, and we welcome this conversation and this sometimes controversy. For example, Breaking the Waves, which some of you may have seen at Opera Comique last May, as you mentioned, deals with big questions about what is the nature of faith, what does it mean to be loyal when all these forces in your life, so your loyalty to God conflicts with your loyalty to your husband. Whose voice do you follow, or do you follow your own unique voice? And I'm interested in creating works where there's not a clear enemy. And something that's interesting about Breaking the Waves is that everyone in the opera is trying to do the thing that they feel is the most good. Goodness, the nature of goodness is a big theme in the work. Yet everything still falls apart in a horrific way. So how do we get from point A to point B? And I think that's life. It's like often in life, people are doing the thing that they think is the most good. I truly believe that in most situations, but yet horrible things still happen. And like, what is that path? So, and I'm not interested in like leaving people with this clear idea of who to root for and who to be against. Yeah, I think those are some things that I look for. Also, I think that opera is very surreal. So everyone's singing their thoughts, like we are not in reality. So I like stories that lean into that surreal nature. So there's an element of magic. There's an element of religion, the presence of God, the church, these forces that are bigger than us, that are sort of moving things. And so I think that those stories work really well on the operatic stage.
And I think that we just want to tell stories that don't let go of us. right? Like that's the number one thing. And I get to work not only with Missy, but with a number of other composers. And so and I love them all. And I just want to give them agency to be themselves. And so it's about finding the story that I think that the composers are going to, just their imaginations are going to get fired up and write the best music for. So with each different collaboration, you talk about different stories and there are different values. But one of my projects that I'm working on right now is an adaptation of Thomas King's Indians on Vacation. And it's a particularly meaningful piece because it's commissioned by two companies in my home country of Canada. But the entire team, aside from me, for the most part, I believe, are Indigenous. And it's just really, really amazing to be able to create a piece with them, for them, that is about contemporary Indigenous identity. And it is about two middle-aged or sort of upper middle-aged Indigenous Canadians who go to Prague on vacation. And we're writing it for this amazing Canadian mezzo-soprano, Marion Newman, who we did a little presentation of it during COVID. I wrote about 15 minutes with the composer Ian Cuson, who is a brilliant Métis composer in Canada. And he, we wrote this 50-minute section, and at the end of, after we recorded it, Marion said, you know, I so often get asked to give voice to Indigenous women who have been raped, murdered, who are missing, who are dealing with intense trauma, and you are writing me an opera about a woman who goes on vacation. And there's something just so remarkable about that. So I'm very proud, and I'm so lucky that they have invited me in to this story, and I got Thomas's blessing to adapt and to organize his ideas into the libretto. It really is the spirit of Thomas is sort of bubbles through every second of that piece. But I'm very much just the sort of the steward of those ideas, and it's very, very meaningful to me.
I think that idea of stewardship is so beautiful that we can just carry these pieces forward, carry new voices forward for other people to hear and then adopt and take up again. Missy, I really liked the comment you made about how opera is quite weird, because it is, and I don't know who is in our audience tonight, but I certainly don't have any background in opera. I find it kind of funky when I go and see it. These people are singing very high pitches, their thoughts, and they use funny accents and they make their voices shake, and I'm wondering, three of you here are so hip and fabulous and wonderful, and you've been drawn to this very strange art form. So tell me, why opera? What can it say that other art forms can't say? I'll start with Nia, and then I'll go.
That's a complex question. What can opera say that can't be said otherwise? Well, I think first what drew me to opera was kind of the difficulty of understanding it and that complexity of it. So I have a background in voice, and when I decided that I wanted to be a composer, most schools in North Carolina, you have to audition on an instrument. Whereas some schools, more conservatories, you may not have to have an instrument as a composer. You can just be like, I'm going to compose, that's my instrument. But no, in North Carolina, most of the universities, you have to play the piano, saxophone. And so I had sang all my life, and I was like, I'm going to sing to get into college for music school. Piano, I was on and off with the lessons. I was like, we're going to just stick to my main instrument. And so when I realized that I couldn't sing like Alicia Keys in my audition, I was like, oh, I need to learn how to sing opera, I guess. Let's do it. So my mom found some voice teachers for me, and one led to another. So I started with one lady who always told me Rome wasn't built in a day. And so I remember starting to sing opera, and it was one of the first songs I learned was more of a Broadway song from the Broadway version of Aida. It's Easy as Life. And that was one of the first songs I was like, okay, this is kind of Broadway, but I need to have vibrato too. And then, years later, probably after about 2 years, I started to find my vibe with it. I started to find my space and my voice, which was so different from the voice I grew up singing with. So basically it was just the complexity of it. Seeing people like Leontine Price, that was someone who, when I realized who she was, I was like, wow, this is incredible. This woman she paved the way for Black opera singers. And then learning about Marian Anderson, who wouldn't sing for segregated audiences. So learning that history of how African Americans weren't necessarily welcomed in this art form, but they were excelling at it, really motivated me too. And then being in like chorus in high school, that all just made me want to pursue it further, like the challenge of it, and the beauty of it. I think opera is so beautiful. It is so, can be so surreal, and people are singing their inner thoughts, and it draws you in a way that other art forms don't always do. And so while it can be, at first, it can seem maybe like it's only for a certain group of people, and that's certainly what I thought when I first discovered opera. I thought it was, you know, you go and you wear your like coattail outfit, like your top hat. That was definitely the perspective that I had. But once you put yourself in those situations, you actually just go and buy the ticket and go sit down and see the opera, you realize that it's much more than just the stereotypical idea of what you may have seen on TV or like watching cartoons, growing up watching the Looney Tunes or something. It's not that at all. It's something so much more complex and beautiful. And if you are open-minded to it, you can grow to love it. So.
Yeah.
Opera.
Yeah, I had it sort of similar. Like I don't know, like if children grow up with opera, I don't think that's a normal thing. But I certainly did not. My family is not musical at all. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. Excuse me. And I came to opera through music videos. So I was not, even before I took piano lessons, I was obsessed with MTV. And I would watch MTV for like hours every day, and I thought, this is it. Like, this is the ultimate art form, is these videos. And this was like in the late 80s, early 90s. This was the time of, Guns N' Roses and these like big rock, metal videos with like storylines and like, people leaving each other at the altar. And it was all these like big emotions. And looking back, like that's where my interest in opera actually started, even though it wasn't until my late 20s that I wrote my first opera, Song from the Uproar, and really thought I could realize something on the stage. And also, it's like opera has changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years, I think, in Europe and really in the US. 15 years ago, young people were not writing much opera. It was not a thing. And then in the last 15 years, there have been so many opportunities for people to write cutting edge opera that deals with contemporary issues. And it's a golden age of American opera right now. And I hope that continues. And I think that enthusiasm is spreading to Europe as well. So I think now there's so many more opportunities to write opera than there were when I was starting out.
Yeah, a similar. Like I came to opera from I listened to country music on the radio. We had Shania Twain and
our favorite girl, of
right,
course.
right,
yes.
Yeah. So opera was not a soundtrack in my house, but I was also I was born in '83, and so I think the internet came into our house in the early '90s, and so I had the agency to go and try to find interesting things, and it was usually weird musical theater stuff. It wasn't opera at that time. But then I had a classical voice teacher who would challenge me and said, go and get some opera CDs and go and listen to these things. And also, what was big for me was the musical Rent, because that was adapted from La Boheme. And so I thought, I need to go and buy some opera books and learn about opera, because maybe my musical that I write will just be sort of a contemporary version of an opera plot. And so that narrative of how Rent was transformed from Boheme was really transformative for me. And then again, I thought that it was, I valued the glamour. I longed for the chandeliers at the Met and the $1,000 gowns and the top hats and all those things. I just thought that was so cool, and the antithesis of my family situation. And then it's not that. We are going to get dressed up in some really cool clothes for the opening of Lincoln in the Bardo in 2026. But maybe not a top hat. Maybe that would actually be appropriate for that one. And Yannick, who will conduct the opera, often wears really cool, like, not costumes, but he will have a flourish in the pit. For Champion, he had the boxing gloves and stuff. So maybe he'll be the representative top hat wearer. Who knows? There will be a top hat somewhere, I'm sure.
Top hats will be had. The hat that you're wearing will grow even longer and taller. Missy, I'm struck by your comment that we're in this sort of golden age of, did you say of American opera or of opera in general?
I mean, I think in opera in general, but really I live in New York, so I've noticed it in America that there were all these smaller companies coming up, particularly in New York City and in LA, and producers like Beth Morrison, who we work with a lot, were producing operas that didn't require a full orchestra and a full chorus, that were maybe like 3 instrumentalists and 2 singers, or less. So it just, opera was, once we abandoned, or once we weren't requiring these big forces, opera became accessible to a lot more artists. Yeah.
Nia, have you noticed this golden age of opera as well?
I have. I believe the organization Opera America is really influential as well. So they are, how do you describe Opera America? They're a membership-based organization, so you can be a member of Opera America, and they have countless programs, events, webinars. I mean, they do a lot to support composers, to support librettists. They have grants. They categorize opera companies in America by how much money they operate on their budgets. Yeah, so they really are helpful and useful in America for that. And also just like Missy said, I think that opera being more accessible, kind of taking away the idea, the stereotype that it has to be an orchestra and a chorus. It can be 2 singers and 2 instrumentalists. It doesn't have to be that grand, which is, I think, what most people think of when they think of opera. So kind of breaking down those barriers has helped a lot. So I've definitely noticed that at one time living in New York, and even seeing things that happen all over America now, different opera companies, Chicago Opera Theater, even the opera company in my hometown, Piedmont Opera, they really they know they need to make it accessible to people, because if you only have an audience from 50 years ago, then the art form can die out. So it's really important to bring in new people, bring in people that don't look like what the audiences were looking like, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. It's really important. So I think it's a golden age. I hope it continues. I still think there's work to be done to make it more accessible and to break down barriers and to make people feel welcomed and not make it seem like it's only for a certain group. But that's up to us and composers that want to do this work and who want to write operas.
And what does that work look like? What's next?
Yeah.
How do we get there?
I think one of the big things I just brought up was budgets, and you have to fund these things. You have to pay people. You have to pay artists what they're worth. And I think it's tiring for people to to feel like they're not being paid what they're worth. Musicians, and of course, when you're coming up or if you're in college, you do things sometimes just for the passion of it, and that certainly is great, and I've done it. But also, being respectful of artists, and that's a big part of the work I've done, advocating for the arts. Education is very important. I think continuing to educate children in public schools so that they can be exposed to opera from a young age, so that when I feel like when you're exposed to it from a younger age, you just can blossom so much more, instead of having to feel like, okay, now that I'm in my 30s, or now that I'm even in my late teens, I'm going to go to my first opera. It can be amazing if you start from a young age and just start to engage with it early. And so just educating people, having administrators who can advocate for artists as well is really important, because it's something that you can't do it alone. Opera takes a lot of work. I think music in general, it's a village to make things happen, whether it's a production, whether it's an opera, whether it's even just setting up a concert for 50 people. It takes work and it takes time and hours. So just that awareness of this isn't something that you just kind of throw together. I think you hear people a lot when you're a singer, right? People will say, "Oh, you're a singer? Can you sing something for me?" And you're just right on the spot. And again, I've done it, but why do I have to? Am I asking? If you're a doctor or if you're a nurse, do I ask you to do something random from your job on the spot? I think there's a respect that we need to kind of demand as artists, and that will give artists more confidence. The idea of like the struggling artist is so tired.
It's so outdated. It's so
struggling
boring.
artist, it is. Like
no more
artists-
struggling. Let's have dinner.
No.
Let's eat. Get these artists a meal.
Absolutely. So I really think all those kind of like those stereotypes and the kind of archaic ways of thinking have to go, and hopefully we can continue to just push against those boundaries and let people see us as full people who are not put in those boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there is an issue, though, to riff on that, where Beth Morrison talks about how right now, after COVID, there's about 30% of the audiences haven't come back. And inflation means that budgets are now 30% more. So there's a 60% gap that we still have to fix. And so there are lots of situations where, yes, we need to be demanding better pay and just respect and all those things. But I do think that we are struggling with just an industry that is having a cash flow problem. And so even if companies do want to pay more money, they don't have it. And so how do we move forward with an industry where the money is just not there? Europe is a little bit different. They still will tell you that there are budgetary insane things happening, but in America we have a particularly rough time right now where the industry just is not back to where it was, and we're dealing with this with quite a deficit in where the money needs to be and where the money is.
I think with the arts in America, again, they're always the first things cut from like our education systems. And so I think, again, that's where it starts, like valuing it, because we know that there is, at least in our education systems, there's a budget there, but, you know, we prioritize certain things over other things. And it's hard. It's because everything matters. But just advocating for ourselves, advocating for our children, for our education systems, because if you're not valuing it at that you know, bare minimum point, education, then how can we see it valued in society?
And I would love to see more school buses full of kids going to dress rehearsals and people underwriting tickets for third graders to go see appropriate operas for that age group, because I think that exposure is huge. I didn't see my first opera live until I was 19 years old. And I saw a lot of theater, a lot of musical things, but opera was something that eluded me until I was an adult. And so I think that if there was an opportunity for young Royce to see something at the age of 6, it would have changed my life.
Can we have a big round of applause on that note for little Royce? It's just been such a pleasure to host the three of you in the library this month, and watch your excellence and to learn from your artistic practices and to see you sort of building opera for the future. We have time now for questions from our in-person audience and our Zoom audience, if we have time for that as well. I've been greedy and taken up a bit more time than I should, but now I open the floor up to you. Raise your hand very high, and Alfonso will bring you a microphone. I will give a microphone to Alfonso, which will be brought to you. This is me officially shutting up.
Hi, that was really interesting. When you're producing a program for the Met, have they raised the money for it first? Or how does it all get funded?
Good question. Unclear. I really don't know. I mean, do we? I doubt it. I think that it's very sort of hand to mouth in America right now with American companies. Again, European companies are very, very different. I feel confident that we've signed a contract and like the piece will happen. But I think it depends on donations year to year and returning donations, because so much of funding in America is, almost 100% is individuals and some foundations, but yeah. Have they committed to actually produce it? Oh yeah, yes. So I'm 99.999% sure it will happen on the day, barring some, knock on wood, barring some crazy event. But it will happen. It will actually start at LA Opera. in February of 2026, and then we'll come to the Met that fall. So October 26th, 2026, please come to New York. It's gonna be great.
This could totally be a rumor or inaccurate, but I've heard this statistic that just boggles me, that Peter Gelb, based on the budget of the Met, has to raise $1 million a day. It is like a $400 million budget. And so that is a commitment, an annual thing, which is very, very, very hard. But I'm sure that he hasn't necessarily put an endowed amount of money in the bank for Lincoln in the Bardo, but they have committed to raising the money, their annual budget, to support the opera when it comes in 2026.
Thank you very much. That was all fascinating. And I just wanted to ask, what was it about the human factor in particular that fascinated you the most and inspired you to write about it?
Well, I think that drama sort of necessitates, unless you're writing for two computers talking to each other. As a theater writer, initially, I went to grad school for musical theater writing. My undergrad was for filmmaking, and then I did post-grad in operatic work. But all of that requires humans communicating to each other and understanding the human experience and the differences in experience. And so I think that was just the guiding thing. I grew up loving going to the theater. I loved when I found international cinema or even American independent cinema of the 90s. And often these like smaller budget films. I'm a huge disciple and work with a lot of Bergman properties. And just the way that Ingmar Bergman is so humanistic in his rendering of humans. All of this was just super exciting. So it wasn't something that I actively chose. It was just something that that made sense, or it was my experience watching different human responses to the world. And trying to find interesting ways to render those experiences on different stages, and now the operatic stage.
Oh, okay, thank you. So my question is a little bit about how we talked about like composing has been a majority male field. So I understand that there is a necessity for diversity because you want to bring a different perspective, right? So I was wondering if you could tell me if there's a difference in the way that female composers tell their stories versus how male composers have told their stories so far.
Can I take this? I've worked with women and men, so I just have I've been asked about this in many interviews, and. The women that I work with are as different on the sort of the continuing spectrum as the men that I work with. There are some men that I work with that if you were given a blind sample, you would think that some of them have a very lyrical quality, and maybe by a strange definition that's more feminine. I don't necessarily equate lyricism with femininity, but maybe somebody would. And there are some composers that I work with that are female composers who are as raw and crazy and aggressive, and you would never know that it's in any way gendered. Or I think you'd have a hard time listening to an opera by Du Yun, for instance, and thinking that was necessarily rendered by a woman or a man. It's by a really badass composer. So yeah, the spectrum is wild, but there's nothing that if I to go to a female composer that I can expect necessarily. But I know Missy's language and I know her metabolism, and it's Missy's. It's not the female Missy's. It's not the male Missy's. It's Missy's language. Yeah.
I also think we have such a small sample size of works from women. So, when I was writing our second opera together, Breaking the Waves, I remember getting a very angry letter from a male journalist that was like, I can't believe a female composer would take on this property because it's very controversial. And I said, well, how many operas by female composers have you seen? He's like, well, too, you know, Kaya Sariaho and Jennifer Higdon. And I'm like, so by that measure, half of all operas by women are in French about medieval stories and half are about this other. So it's like it's too small of a sample to judge yet. And I do think maybe in 200 years, scholars can look back and say, oh, you know, women received these kinds of opportunities. I do think that that's very interesting, that women often write their first opera, you know, 10 years later than men, because men receive opportunities earlier in their career and women have to show proof that they can do things like for years before they're given an opportunity. So maybe that has an effect. I believe that, you know, and women are treated very differently in the world. So I think that there is something there, but I think it's going to be a while before we can make any conclusions about it.
Can I just make a comment? Yeah. If you compare Edith Smyth's The Wrecker to Puccini's La Bohème, which is written by a man and which is written by a woman? Because The Wrecker is absolutely horrific. La Bohème is a total cheer.
And I think we have this tendency to think, I get this question a lot, like, oh, do you think women are more sympathetic to their characters? Because I think women are more in society seen as caretakers. So the idea that a woman would write something violent or sexual or, you know, crazy or have a character that's mentally ill goes against what society expects from women.
Sure. I do see both sides of it, and I think that it just depends on the woman and depends on the person. So as far as how women tell their stories, I think that it's really individual, but kind of on the beyond the, I guess, the artistic side of it, I think maybe more the how you present yourself side of it. I had a teacher once tell me that when he's working with his composers who are women, typically their name is so small in their music. So I wonder if that translates into the works that we create too. And so that really is something that will stay with me forever, because it's just a reminder to take up space in your work and not to be afraid to tell those big stories or whatever story you want to tell, and not to feel like you have to fit someone else's mold.
You mentioned that the opera world is more democratized now than it has been in the past, and that there were changes in the last 20 years or so. But in my limited experience with opera, to me it still seems like it's a very limited and elite presentation for specific audiences in very large halls like the Metropolitan at very high ticket prices. I see that the subject matters have expanded and the presentation in style has expanded, but how to really reach the broader audiences? How are you seeing that occur?
Yeah, I mean, I think those ticket prices need to come down. And this is something where I'm always so, again, not to bite the hand that feeds me, but I know, as we've talked about a lot, the Met is in an incredibly difficult position financially now, as are all opera companies in America. But that is a big thing. And I think that here my friend was telling me, oh, I can get student tickets to the opera for €9 here. It's like, oh, that's amazing. And that's why I think we were at the Exterminating Angel at Paris Opera, the Thomas Addis opera on Sunday. And it was full of young people with extravagant eyeliner and like amazing clothes. And I was like, this is the opera audience that I really want. But there's work to be done with ticket price. We had an opera go viral on TikTok. And again, social media is not the one answer to reaching a broader audience, but it was amazing how many people have come up to us and say, oh, I saw that opera on TikTok. And it was an opera about teenagers smoking outside of a classroom in high school. Or this was a scene, not the whole opera, but there was a scene that featured this. And so it was appealing to them. So I think it's a lot of different factors.
These kids lost their mind. They could not believe that an opera could have people smoking marijuana outside of a classroom. And millions of people watched this 30-second clip with salty language, and they're just like, if I knew that opera could be this, I'd go every weekend. The other thing about your Met comment, though, is that on Mondays to Thursdays, there is an underwritten, there are 150 seats, I believe, in the orchestra for like $25 or something. So absolutely, there are tons of, and I think that there are people who, there's this myth that the Met is so expensive, and there are tickets that are $400 or $800, but there are absolutely seats that you can get for $25 that people just think that they don't exist. And I also find it interesting that people will complain about the cost of opera tickets, but then they will pay $1,000 to go and see Taylor Swift. So, or $400 to go and see a hockey game. So I can't help you if you don't value. We can only present what, absolutely. So democratizing is sort of in all the ways, but there is this strange barrier in both the ballet world and in opera where people think that the price is too exorbitant. And that's not the case, and we need to sort of remove that stigma because there are so many ways. But I think that one of the things is just having people having access to things, and is there a way that we can underwrite so that 15-year-olds are going to the opera for free, so that if they can't afford a $25 ticket, or that it becomes part of their education, it becomes part of a language arts or an English class to go and see an opera in English, or a French class to go and see an opera in French, for goodness sakes. Like, I think that there's just so many ways that we can aid in the exposure of what we do and show our values, our artistic values, and why we think opera is important. And we do that by writing our pieces and telling the stories that we choose to tell with the musical languages that we tell them in.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I do think telling stories that are relatable, that's one of the biggest things I hear from people. It's all about feeling that connection, and if you aren't necessarily someone who is into opera, or you think you're not into opera, maybe going to see an opera that's modern for your first time could really be interesting, or maybe not. Maybe seeing a classic is better, but I definitely think that to retain an audience, having variety, telling modern stories, that's what opera was doing in the time it was created. I mean, sometimes historically they would go back and use older stories, but telling like the stories of the time, the modern time.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?